Welcome, everyone, to AAUC's monthly podcast series, Building Our Collective American Dream. I'm Jack Hanna, your host today, and AAUC board member. This month, we have a very special guest that you will find provides an important and mostly unheard voice from an overlooked Asian American community. Our guest, Joe Enlet, is one of 3 consul generals of the United Federation of Micronesia. Join us as Joe describes several topics that are little understood, such as Micronesia's unusual diplomatic relationship with the U.S., the vast geography of the Pacific Islands, and their specific communities, along with how they are somewhat included and perhaps overlooked in the API community. Joe also talks about the challenges that Micronesian immigrants in the United States faced regarding the lack of health care and the devastating exposure to COVID-19 they endured. Lastly, but most importantly, Joe provides a unique perspective on the existential threat of global warming by a community that is at the forefront of higher water levels, damaged coral reefs, and the deterioration of the fishing industries along with that of the world. Let us now join Joe and hear his advocacy for the Pacific Islanders and the necessity of geopolitics to focus first and foremost on the environment as opposed to military and diplomatic competition between the United States, China, and other countries. Welcome, Joe Enlet, to AAUC's podcast series, Building Our Collective American Dream. We are so happy that you've joined us today, and we welcome you. Joe, please describe how you came to the United States and how you acquired your role and responsibilities as Consul General for the Federation of Micronesia in Oregon and the services you provide.
Well, thank you for having me, Jack, and the AAUC. I came to the United States back in 2007. I moved to Oregon. I came to actually pursue my graduate school. I just was really passionate about that, especially because of my own personal experience coming to the United States as an immigrant from the Micronesian Islands, which covers the Republic of Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. So I moved to the United States with the intention of going to school, but then was pulled in because I just had this passion for looking after our community and making sure that the people who come from our Pacific Islander region do not experience the same kinds of hardship that I felt, because I looked around and there was no Pacific Islander services or any kind of organization or agency that really knew in depth about Micronesians and what Micronesians qualify for or their status in the US. So during that time, we began to organize our communities and then founding actually an organization called the COFA Alliance National Network, or CAN, which specifically the mission is to advocate for and promote social justice and economic justice for islanders from the Micronesian region living here in the United States. Our work put us into the public eye as well as our governments. I'm talking about the Micronesian government or the FSM government. They saw the work we were doing. And at that time, the FSM government was also very keen on opening up a consulate general office here in the Pacific Northwest. And that really is because there's a large number of Micronesians living here in the Pacific Northwest, probably the largest community outside of Hawaii. Hawaii has the largest. So when the government was seeking to establish a consulate presence here in Oregon, particularly, they approached me. I'm thinking it's because they saw that we were already doing this type of work to organize community and seek out ways that our people can better integrate into the area. So they approached me. It is an appointed position. So that's how I got into this.
Congratulations on your appointment. And Joe, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm mistaken, there are 3 Federation of Micronesia councils. Is that correct? And when were they established?
So we have 2 offices, one in Guam and one in Hawaii, that have been there for years. So this is the newest consulate in the U.S. So on the mainland, this is the only consulate for Micronesia, in addition to, of course, the FSM embassy in Washington, D.C.
What specific legal and political relationships does Micronesia have with the United States as far as trade, economics, and entry into the United States, along with government entitlements?
Our relationship with the United States began very early on. World War II, during that time, the Micronesian islands were under Japanese rule. The Micronesian region actually became a very important region during that war, and we faced some pretty bloody battles there. But then when the United States won, we became entrusted by the League of Nations back then to the United States. We became essentially a territory of the US. So for many years, we were under kind of US guardianship till the late 70s and 80s when we got our independence. And then in 1986, we entered into a treaty with the United States called the Compact of Free Association, or COFA for short. Now, this compact is a pretty complex treaty, but some of the main provisions of the treaty is that this association with the United States means that for Micronesians, we have free entry into the US without the need for a green card or a visa. So Micronesians can come and go to the United States, but that's also vice versa. So US citizens can also come to Micronesia as they please. Further to that, the United States has full military authority over the entire Micronesian region. Basically, that means that the US military has rights to our land, our ocean area, and also our space, and has the responsibility to protect the Micronesian islands. With that relationship as well, that strategic relationship for the United States, it also has what's called denial rights. So basically, the US can deny any other world power entry into our area. Other provisions of the compact means that the United States would give funding to the Micronesian islands. Now, those three independent Micronesian nations are, as I mentioned, Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. Each have their version of that compact with the United States, but very similar. So the economic assistance that comes from the United States is really geared towards two sectors, which is health and education. So the US does provide funding in those areas and continues to also provide certain technical assistance and funding for infrastructure development as well. So those are the formal relationships that the US and Micronesia has together in this treaty, or the COFA. Now, as far as people moving to the United States, here's where it gets a little complicated, because folks who do come enter under the status of non-immigrants. That's the formal status. However, there are certain differences between just a non-immigrant from another country, for instance, from a non-immigrant from the Micronesian region because of this treaty. Let me just give you an example. So in 1996, when there was that Welfare Reform Act under the Clinton administration, there was a recategorizing of people who are eligible and people who are not eligible. Most of our people thought that because we enter and are eligible to be living in the United States without a visa requirement, that we would continue to be qualified or eligible aliens for safety net programs such as Medicaid, welfare, and essential services. However, because of the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, somehow we fell through the cracks. So our people did not qualify then for all safety net programs that are funded by the federal government. So that meant that we did not qualify for Medicaid, temporary assistance for needy families, for food stamps, and things of that nature. And that was the case for over 20 years. It wasn't until COVID-19 and people seeing the devastating impact of COVID-19 on Pacific Islanders particularly, that the federal government was moved then to restore Medicaid eligibility for Micronesians. So that happened actually last year. Congress finally, after 20 or so tries, to restore that eligibility. So our community today in the US, which is about 100,000 people from the COFA countries, are now for the first time eligible for Medicaid. That's an example of how, though we have this relationship, sometimes there are still policy barriers.
Joe, while we're on this topic, could you please describe what I understand to be one of the most significant impacts on any ethnic community in the country as far as COVID-19 is concerned, and how it affected the Micronesian community in particular?
we all know that when they started tracing COVID-19, according to people's ethnicities, they found that Pacific Islanders in many states, including Oregon, Washington, even Midwestern states like Arkansas, they found that Pacific Islanders had some of the highest rates of infection, but also fatalities to COVID-19. There are many different factors, and I think the research is still out on why that is, but a lot of it had to do with, at least for the Micronesians, that we have not had access to healthcare and health insurance in this country since 1996. What that does is it creates a situation where Micronesians do not have primary care. They don't have access to preventive care. Many people live through chronic diseases, and there's a high rate of that, especially when you are low income. You're supposed to qualify for Medicaid, but you don't because of this federal barrier. Also, they are part of the essential services community. They were continuing to keep the economy floating during the early part of COVID-19, plus the fact that it is part of our culture for people to come together. So that also kind of contributed to the virus being passed on to others in our community. I think that really, in some sense, showed how significantly under-resourced our community has been for years. So there is a silver lining in what happened in COVID-19. Here in Oregon, local public agencies and the state said, hey, these folks are getting large numbers of COVID-19 infection and fatalities and hospitalizations. Let's give them resources to be able to combat this. So that's what happened with COVID-19 and our community.
For those in our audience that aren't familiar with Pacific Islander communities, could you please provide us with a quick overview of the major communities there, such as Micronesia, Polynesia, and
the Caroline Islands,
other communities? Thank you.
So the Pacific, or Oceania as it's called, often when people talk about Pacific Islanders, they refer to these three large categories of islands. You mentioned Polynesia, and then Micronesia is where I'm from. And then you have actually Melanesia, that's more southern and west of Polynesia. So the three categories are Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. Polynesia is probably the most well-known. That's also the largest area geographically. It includes Hawaii and Tonga and Samoa and Tahiti. Those are some of the islands within the Polynesian region. The Melanesian region, the northernmost, has the islands like Fiji. Those are our brothers and sisters south of us. In the north is Micronesia. Micronesia, as I mentioned, includes the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Palau, the Republic of the Marshall Islands. But then it also includes the Republic of Kiribati, another island nation there, and Nauru. Nauru is also part of the Micronesian region. And when we talk about geographically, then that also includes Guam and the Northern Marianas. And each island within the Pacific has their own kind of political status. Some are independent nations, but then some have like an affiliation or are a territory of other countries. So it's important for people to know the differences, but also to understand the diversity of cultures and the diversity of people that come from this area, which covers actually the largest area in the world, but it is also the most unknown part of the world. So that's the Pacific.
I have been particularly struck, along with many other Asian Americans, that the Pacific Island community has not had the profile and public attention that other Asian communities have. Why is that? Is it the small demographics, lack of political power, financial resources? And how do you change that going forward?
Well, that's a big question. I think it is a combination of the things you mentioned. Pacific Islanders have not had the public attention like other communities. It is a combination of a small demographics, the lack of political power, and financial resources, which I like to say critical investments within our community. But I think also it comes to the ways in which racial story has always been told. When you put the social construct of API together, that in itself itself is a flaw. And I think that's one of the fundamental reasons why Pacific Islanders have often been overshadowed. That's not our community's faults. That is because some people who are making the decisions about how to categorize race, they put the Pacific Islanders under the API acronym. You can do just a simple Google search and search for islanders or islands on the internet. You will always find API organization or API this, API that, because it's hard to find any place where Pacific Islanders are really carved out as its own community. Now, you go further in the Google search and you click on these organizations, many times you will go in there and there is not a single Pacific Islander person in this organization or on this board or on this committee. Now, that's a problem because the organization will continue to call itself API, even though they have no PI on the organization. Like I said, this is because people back then who were creating these categories decided to do this, and we have been living with that. I will say that there's always pros and cons. The pro is that Pacific Islanders are kind of by extension then put into the conversation when there are API organizations that are serious about being included of the Pacific Islander communities. But the negative side is that our concerns, our people, our identities are often overshadowed to the point where they basically are non-existent when people are counting others. Our particular stories, like you wouldn't have known that Pacific Islanders had some of the highest rates of COVID-19 had you not tracked particularly the PI group. So those are some of the difficulties that Pacific Islanders face. And yes, you're right also. Because of that, as a direct or indirect consequence is that we lack financial resources because we can't compete as a small community of Pacific Islanders to get resources. We're overlooked by agencies, whether intentionally or non-intentionally. And those are some of the reasons why we don't have that attention. We don't have that built infrastructure to be able to build up a presence in the community, have our people go and sit on boards and commissions, and have a voice in the public policy arena. So your last question was, how do you change that? Well, that's $1 million question. I do think it's things like this. You reaching out, doing a podcast with Pacific Islander and talking specifically about the Pacific Islander community. I think that's the only way we can do this is by exposing Pacific Islanders. And also, we have established organizations, we have established communities. We need to have those communities be inclusive and open and give space to Pacific Island. Well, we also have to have Pacific Islander communities themselves become more confident. And I always talk about confidence. You know, Pacific Islanders culturally, and I don't want to create a generalization here, but for me and for many of our Micronesian communities, for example, we're kind of known to be laid back people who are very mellow. They don't often speak up. We just kind of go with the flow. Again, I don't want to generalize too much, but that's the way that we are seen by others. And sometimes when you're seen that way, you begin to live like that. You accept that that's you. But deep rooted in our cultures is also a culture of people who are navigators, of people who traveled the world around with just using stars and using the waves and did not have modern technology, but we were able to travel long distances. And these are sacred knowledge and wisdoms that have been passed down. So in us is a culture of discovery, of resourcefulness. We also are known as warriors, the people who do fight for the things that matter to them. These are the kinds of things that I think need to be more appreciated, but also I think we need to revive those kinds of values within our own Pacific Islanders so that we can be confident to speak up for our communities and be out there. And we just have to invest in our communities. I think there's no way around it. Decision makers have to continue to invest in particular communities, including Pacific Islanders, because when we do have those investments, we can be able to continue to build an infrastructure of material resources to help people be able to survive and integrate in society. Because you can't ask a community to be engaged and involved and go speak up if they're needs are not met, if they are trying to survive. But I think it's important for policymakers and people who are making decisions about where to allocate public funds to know that Pacific Islanders do need those resources as well. Partnerships is important, to partner with other communities like the Asian American community, like the Latino community, like the African American communities. We are powerful when we come together and unite, and also at the same time be able to use our existing platforms to help highlight those of us who are not always in the spotlight. So I think these are just some of the strategies that we could use to continue to build attention for Pacific Islanders and also give opportunities to Pacific Islanders to lead. It would be great, since we have API communities, say, let's have a Pacific Islander lead this API organization for once, right? I think a very low hanging fruit here, but you asked me the question, so I speak my truth.
And it's a great answer that I agree with. My last question for you. The United States and China, the last few years and even weeks, have focused a great deal of diplomatic and military attention on the Pacific Islander community. I read that a representative of Fiji recently stated its most important challenge it faces is not international geopolitics, but global warming. Describe the challenges that global warming has for Micronesia and other Pacific Island communities, and how critical is it?
Thank you, Jack, for this question. Indeed, climate change and particularly global warming is the most critical issue for Pacific Islanders. It is an existential threat, and it is our number one priority as Pacific Islanders. I agree with the sentiments from the representative from Fiji that that is our most important challenge. Now, I will try to connect the dots here, though. Global warming has caused sea levels to rise. That, of course, threatens our small, low-lying islands, many of these islands which are not higher than 4 or 5 feet above sea level. We have been facing a lot of inundation and flooding on these islands, and once the sea kind of touches our crops, then it kills the crops, which are important resources for our people's survival. But not only what's growing inland, it's also threatening even the fish in the sea. With global warming, you have acidification of the ocean that's increasing, and then you also have things like coral bleaching, killing all the corals, and the biodiversity is under attack, which then obviously leads to a dying out of our fish. Our communities also rely on fisheries because the tuna stocks that run through our islands, they're the major source of tuna in the world. But that's important both for our livelihoods, since we all rely on our natural marine resources, but it's also important for our economic survival because our governments do rely heavily on the revenue that's generated from fisheries. Many world nations come and fish in our waters. And so that's how we're able to sustain our governments as well. So those are the things that are being affected by climate change, among other things. And so basically touches our ability to survive in this world. Now, I like how you posed the question by talking about US and China and geopolitics, because directly those have implications on climate change. And US and China in particular are the largest emitters in the world. And we cannot combat climate change successfully if either one of those countries are not in the game. We have to have both the US and China, because the US can't do it on its own and China can't do it on its own as well. Those two have to come together, of course, with the entire international community coming together. But we do think that with all that's happening within our region and the attention that's given to our region, Pacific Islanders must continue to sound the alarm for climate change. Decisions that are being made today often are made from the standpoint of a large industrialized nation that has resources within their reach. But the plight of Pacific Islanders has to be elevated. And for allies like the US, we need their partnership. We need for them to continue to sound the alarm with us so that world countries make decisions that ultimately curb the warming of our planet. We often refer to the Pacific Islands and the Pacific Island nations as small. in the last few years, I have refused to use the word small. When you think about climate change, you have to think about not just number of people, but you also have to look at, for example, our islands cover millions of square miles of ocean. And the ocean, we know, is one of the biggest resources we have with as carbon sink. They bring down carbon and absorb that. So in order to be able to combat global warming, we also need the oceans, and we need this big area to be involved and for people to respect that resource. We are also home to billions and billions of life forms in the ocean. And so when we come to the table to talk about climate change from a Pacific Islander perspective, we are not representing just a few people. We're representing a huge area called the Blue Continent, and we're representing the billions of life forms that have lived and live in the oceans and on our lands. And so that is kind of the perspective I hope we can continue to have while the world is kind of focusing attention on the Pacific.
Well, it's a huge responsibility and an exemplary one for all communities throughout the world to focus on and to learn the lessons that you are advocating on our behalf, in addition to your community. Thank you for joining us today. It was great to have you. A very important conversation that we look forward to sharing throughout our API community and also generally with all citizens. Joe, we wish you the best.
Thank you for having me.
Joe Enlet's presentation provided us with a very insightful explanation of the overlooked Pacific Island community that has faced unique and difficult challenges regarding its low public profile, the tragic consequences of not having healthcare availability during the COVID-19 pandemic, and being an almost forgotten member of the Pacific Asian American community. His description of Oceania, the major island groups, and its variety of cultures provides us with a better understanding of their distinctive heritage and identity. Lastly, Joe and Micronesia are at the very forefront of the global warming threat that is increasing day. They are enduring the most direct consequences of this crisis and are suffering the immediate adverse results that is affecting all of us. We at AAUC commend Joe and the Federation of Micronesia on the work they do and the advocacy they assert, not only their country, but the entire world. Thank you for joining us today, and please view our website that now features our annual AAUC National Civil Leadership Conference in Las Vegas, September 11th through the 13th. Please join us for this major event promoting the Asian American community's leadership efforts throughout the United States.
This is Dr. S.K. Low, President of Asian American Unity Coalition, or in short, AAUC. Thank you for listening to our AAUC podcast series on building our collective American dream. Please subscribe and comment on our podcast and tune in to our next podcast episode on the last Sunday of each month at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The AAUC podcast is supported by our active individual lifetime members and organization members. For more information about AAUC, please go to our website at asamunitycoalition.org.